Good day. Today is Wednesday, 8th April 2026, and before I proceed with this program, let me remind you again to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. If once you watch this program, you decide that you like what you've heard and you wish to indicate that fact. Well, yesterday in the US-Iran conflict was perhaps the most difficult and the most fraught day. It began with clear indications that we were heading towards a major military confrontation, a massive escalation of the crisis in the Middle East, and it ended, as sometimes happens in wars of this kind, in the announcement of what looks like a very fragile ceasefire. I'm going to anticipate by saying that the ceasefire bears every sign of what you would expect from an agreement which has been made without the two parties having met, without the two parties having exchanged messages, with the two parties relying entirely on the services of an intermediary, in this case the Pakistani government, and therefore without the details of the ceasefire properly hammered out. So we have extraordinary statements being made by all sides which don't fully, which are not always consistent with each other. So, for example, the Iranians and the Pakistanis clearly assumed that the ceasefire would extend to the fighting in Lebanon. In fact, the Pakistani foreign minister said as much. This, however, was then quickly contradicted by the Israeli government and eventually by the United States, so that fighting between Hezbollah and Israel in Lebanon continues, and I believe is actually even intensifying. Then there is the question of what happens with the Strait of Hormuz. The United States, many Western commentators, Western officials, US officials, speak of Iran agreeing to allow unrestricted trade through the Strait of Hormuz. In other words, a return to the situation which existed before the start of the conflict, where ships would be able to travel backwards and forwards through the Strait of Hormuz without hindrance. The Iranian Foreign Minister Abbas Araghchi, however, said in a statement that what had been agreed would be a regime whereby Iran would retain control of the Strait of Hormuz, and ships could apply to pass through the Strait of Hormuz, but would have to agree this with the Iranian authorities and might be prevented from transiting through the Strait of Hormuz for technical reasons. And then there were reports later over the course of the day whereby it was alleged that the Iranians and the Omanis had come to an agreement with each other whereby ships that wished to pass through the Strait of Hormuz would pay a transit fee in Chinese currency, with the proceeds being divided equally between Oman and Iran. So all of this is in contradiction, and as I said, it's exactly what you would expect when a ceasefire has been agreed without the details being properly hammered out as a result of direct in-person talks. And here we come back to the problem. because President Trump has for about 2 weeks been suggesting that negotiations between Iran and the United States were underway. I have been deeply skeptical that that was the case. Subsequently, it turned out, and in fact the Iranians themselves confirmed, that Iran does receive messages from the United States, but does so through intermediaries. And it's clear increasingly that the intermediary has been Pakistan. But there have been no negotiations. And in fact, what has happened, all that has happened, is that the Iranians received from the Americans a 15-point plan, which set out all of the usual demands that the United States has made throughout the history, recent history of relations between Iran and the United States, a complete end of nuclear enrichment, massive limitations on Iran's ballistic missile arsenal, that sort of thing. And the Iranians, in response, have provided the United States with their 10-point plan, which I will come to in a moment. So that is, in effect, the only actual negotiations, if one can call it that has taken place up to now. What happened yesterday is that the Pakistani authorities made a major push for a ceasefire, a 2-week ceasefire, and were able to get the Iranians and the Americans to agree to this, but not, importantly, the Israelis. And, well, as often happens with intermediaries, each side, the Iranians and the Americans, went away claiming or suggesting that the ceasefire has been agreed on the basis of a future negotiation based on each side's proposal. So the Americans are emphasizing the 15-point plan, which the Iranians have rejected, and the Iranians, having rejected the 15-point plan, are saying that all future discussions will be based around their 10-point plan. So this is a chaotic, unsatisfactory outcome, to put it mildly. We do have a ceasefire, or perhaps a pause might be a more accurate description. The US Vice President J.D. Vance has said that this pause is extremely fragile. He is absolutely right, because when agreements are entered in this way, without proper discussion, without proper preparation, without proper meetings between each side, then, well, doubts, ambiguities, uncertainties, like the ones that I have already discussed, are bound to emerge. So let's discuss in a moment how we got here, but let's also discuss who came out of this in the stronger position. And here I'm going to give an unequivocal answer. Despite all the fragilities, despite all the ambiguities, the Iranians have come out in a stronger position. They are in a much stronger position than they were before the conflict began on the 28th of February. There have been articles in both the US and British media confirming as much. In the British media by people like David Blair in the Daily Telegraph and Julian Borger in The Guardian, and they are right. There are similar commentaries in the United States. That also appears to be the view in Israel, where Mr. Lapid, the main opposition leader in the Knesset, has excoriated Prime Minister Netanyahu for the fact that this ceasefire agreement was reached without Israel even being consulted in advance, and on terms which are better for Iran than for the United States or indeed for Israel. And, well, the Pakistani media, which is sympathetic to Iran also, anyway, they are now also writing, they're also saying that this ceasefire was overall a victory for Iran rather than for the United States. Now, rather than for the United States and Israel, and that the reason for that is that Iran has undoubtedly, indisputably come out of this 40 days of fighting in a stronger position. And here, perhaps, it's worth going back to the situation in February. Now, there have been some denials, or shall we say pretenses, that this has not been the case, but it is indisputable, so far as I'm concerned, if you look at the public record, that the United States began the operation against Iran on the 28th of February with the intention of achieving regime change there. The President of the United States made comments promising the Iranian people that their liberation was at hand. He spoke about the evil regime in Iran, the terrorist regime in Iran. He openly talked about regime change in Truce social posts. And, well, beyond that, at one point, he was even talking about the need for Iran to surrender unconditionally. So there is no doubt that that was the US objective. And as I will discuss later in this program, we have a massive article in the New York Times which appears to confirm that that was indeed the plan all along, and it explains why the president thought that might happen and the role that Prime Minister Netanyahu and the Israeli intelligence agency Mossad played in making him believe that. But I will come to that later in this program. Prior to the start of the conflict, even as it became increasingly obvious to me that the conflict was coming, I said that certain statements about Iran made by President Trump over the course of his State of the Union address put the issue, as far as I was concerned, beyond doubt. An attack on Iran intended to achieve regime change in that country was clearly on the way. Well, that attack came, and as I and we, Alex Christoforou and I said on the Duran, the key, given that this was obviously a regime change operation, would be whether or not the government of Iran, the political system there, survived. And exactly as you would expect from a regime change operation, it began with a massive decapitation strike that killed the supreme leader. And there were all sorts of reports floating around about contacts by the US and Israel with all sorts of dissident officials within Iran, military officers. The former head of the Quds Special Forces Group of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps, all of those things. And the point I made, and we made on the Duran was that if regime change did not happen, if it did not happen quickly, if the government of Iran absorbed the blow and survived, then over time the balance of advantage would tilt in Iran's favor. American military arsenals would become depleted, the Strait of Hormuz would be closed, oil prices would rise, and the balance of advantage would shift in Iran's favor. And I'm going to suggest that that is exactly what happened. The Iranian government did survive the initial blow. It grew stronger and stronger thereafter with each passing day. There was a consolidation of support within Iran, and as a result, the Iranians were able to force an end to the conflict, not perhaps having achieved their more grandiose maximalist terms, their demands for reparations, for the closure of all US bases in the Persian Gulf, for those sort of things. But they were able to force an end to the conflict with the government itself intact, with Iran in control of all of its territory, and vitally and importantly, with Iran clearly still in control of the Strait of Hormuz, as Iranian officials have said. And that puts Iran in a decisive advantage in any future negotiations. Whereas before the start of the war, before the American attack on the 28th of February, there were legitimate reasons to doubt that Iran would remain stable and would be able to absorb the blow. There were uncertainties about the scale of Iran's arsenal, its ability to strike back at American targets across the Middle East, to inflict damage upon them, its ability to strike at Israel itself, its ability to close the Strait of Hormuz. There were articles, I remember, which expressed skepticism about whether the Strait of Hormuz by Iran was even possible, and if it was, whether it would even have the effect on the global energy system that many feared. Well, we now have clarity on all of these points. The Iranian government survived. It retained its ability to hit back at targets across the Middle East. It did devastating damage to the American bases. It destroyed the American radar stations. It destroyed a US AWACS aircraft in Saudi Arabia. It was able to steadily attack and hit and destroy targets within Israel itself. The government in Iran not only survived, but was able to demonstrate its ability to hit back. And it was able also, of course, to close the Strait of Hormuz with all of the devastating consequences that we have seen over the last few weeks. Some of us, before the start of the conflict on the 28th of February, guessed that some of this might happen, but by definition, we could not know. Now we do know. We know how strong Iran is, and so, of course, does the United States. So, whereas in the negotiations before the 28th of February, it appeared that it was the United States that was overwhelmingly the stronger party, the conflict has now redressed the balance, and it turns out that Iran is much stronger than the United States supposed, and is therefore in a much stronger position to drive a very hard bargain. And of course, the Iranians are putting it even more strongly than that. They say that the reason that there was a ceasefire at all was because the United States has agreed that in future the negotiations will be based on Iran's proposals, its 10-point plan. Now, that is remarkable, if it is true, given the nature of these proposals, which are, it must be said, extremely tough. The Iranians have provided us with their own account of these proposals, which are as follows: no new aggression against Iran, continued Iranian control of the Strait of Hormuz, acceptance of enrichment, removal of all primary sanctions, removal of all secondary sanctions, termination of all UN Security Council resolutions, termination of all of Board of Governors resolutions, payment of compensation to Iran, withdrawal of US combat forces from the region, cessation of war on all fronts, including against the Islamic resistance of Lebanon. Anyway, the Iranians say that as part of this ceasefire agreement, the United States has agreed that in future negotiations will be based upon these Iranian proposals. And the extraordinary thing is that the President of the United States, Donald Trump himself, is now giving reasons to think that this might actually be true, because he has said in several statements that the United States has received the 10-point proposals from Iran, the proposals that I've just read out, that these do form a good basis for future discussion. He even reposted them himself, suggesting that he does indeed endorse them as a potential basis for future discussion. So the Iranians can, as of the time of making of this program, genuinely, properly argue that they have fought the United States to a standstill. They are in control of all of their territory, that their government and political system has survived the American-Israeli attack and is intact, that they have shown that they're able to take the battle to their enemy, that they have retained complete control of the Strait of Hormuz, which before the war was regarded by the rest of the international community as an international waterway, and that they've got the Americans to agree to sit down and talk with the Iranians about a set of proposals which includes payment of compensation to Iran, withdrawal of all US military forces, apparently from the entire Middle East, a cessation of hostilities in Lebanon between Israel and Hezbollah, unrestricted enrichment of uranium by Iran on its own territory and lifting of all sanctions on Iran, both primary and secondary. Now, that is an enormous success from an Iranian point of view, if it is indeed what they have actually achieved. And, well, the point has actually been made by one, in my opinion, very acute observer of this conflict, who is none other than Dmitry Medvedev, who is, of course, vice chairman of Russia's Security Council, but is also a former president and prime minister of Russia, who is, in other words, a very experienced political leader and international statesman, indeed. And Medvedev has published this comment about this ceasefire, and he says this: the US-Iran conflict has been put on hold. Predictably, both sides are claiming victory. So who won? First of all, common sense did, though faith in it was badly shaken when the White House started talking about wiping out Iranian civilization in one day. I will return to that appalling post of President Trump's later in this program. And then Medvedev continues, still, the very fact that Trump agreed to discuss the 10-point plan is a win for the Iranians. The question is whether Washington will accept it, since it includes, amongst other things, compensation for the damage inflicted on Iran, the continuation of its nuclear program, and Tehran's control of the Strait of Hormuz. The answer is clearly no. That would be humiliating and would amount to a real victory for Iran. So what then? Back to war? That's possible, but there is also another option. Trump neither wants nor can sustain a long war, and he won't find support in Congress for one either. This means he must maintain the fragile ceasefire and pretend that everything is fine, because every step on this board pushes the situation closer to Zugzwang. Yes, I think I was the first person to bring up the expression Zugzwang in describing Trump's dilemmas in this conflict. Now everybody is using it, including, of course, Medvedev. Of course, he comes from the preeminent chess nation, so of course he knows all about it himself. But then Medvedev continues, but this is a game of chess with 3 players, not 2. There's also Israel, which is not playing on the US side. It has no use for a ceasefire, and it has not achieved its objectives. It could very well make its own move, simply sweep all the pieces off the board. That makes the situation highly uncertain. And then Medvedev continues with other rude comments about the Europeans, which I will not touch on in this program, just to say. But on the face of it, in fact, not just on the face of it, in fact, Medvedev is right. The Iranians, as of today, can validly say to themselves, we did not achieve the complete victory over the Americans that we said we would. We repeatedly said that we would not accept a temporary ceasefire, but we have achieved a great deal. We have massively strengthened our negotiating position. We have got the Americans to agree to discuss our terms for a final resolution of the conflict, and we have retained control of the Strait of Hormuz. Now, how did this all come about? Why are we in this situation? And I propose to discuss the Americans first before returning to the Iranians again. There has been a huge article about the origins of the war in the New York Times. And the article, it seems to me, goes a significant way to corroborating the account of Joe Kent, President Trump's director of counterterrorism, who resigned from the administration, stating his strong opposition to the war. And Joe Kent said that the United States got propelled into the war because of advice and insistence by Israel that the war should be begun against Iran, and that if it was begun, it would end quickly in a victory. Now, at this point, I should say that it seems to me that Prime Minister Netanyahu, who has been the dominant figure in Israeli politics for arguably the last 30 years, has been harping about Iran, well, for at least 25 of those 30 years. He first started to do it, as I remember, in the early 2000s. He has been endlessly, constantly insisting that Iran is on the brink of acquiring a nuclear weapons capability, ignoring advice to the contrary from the US intelligence community and the fatwa of the former Iranian Supreme Leader, Ayatollah Ali Khamenei. And he's been a major advocate of a war against Iran, which I suspect he sees as necessary in order to achieve Israel's strategic dominance in the Middle East, but which, beyond such tactical calculations, I feel has, for him personally now, long since become a personal obsession. I can remember how in August 2024, he came to Washington, he addressed Congress, he spoke about how when the United States and Israel fight together, they win. I said at the time of this speech that Netanyahu was clearly advocating for a war against Iran. I spoke about this in programs made at the time on this channel, and he has advocated for a war relentlessly ever since. By the way, here I ought to say that what Netanyahu said to Congress back in August 2024 was actually false. Israel does not have the ability by itself, short of using nuclear weapons, of defeating Iran. It cannot defeat Iran, a far bigger country than itself. When Prime Minister Netanyahu spoke about Israel and the United States fighting together and winning, what he really meant was that he wanted a war against Iran, fought against Iran overwhelmingly by the United States, but ultimately in Israel's interests, or perhaps more precisely, more accurately, Prime Minister Netanyahu's interpretation and assessment of Israel's interests. Anyway, what we now learn from the New York Times is that Prime Minister Netanyahu came to Washington on the 11th of February. He did so on a day when he knew that the Vice President, J.D. Vance, who is known to be opposed to further military conflicts involving the United States in the Middle East. Well, on the 11th of February, Vance was away. He wasn't just out of Washington. He was out of the United States on a visit to Azerbaijan. And Netanyahu had a meeting in the Oval Office with the president, with Donald Trump. Netanyahu brought the head of Mossad with him. And Netanyahu told Trump that now was the moment to launch the war against Iran. The government there was weak. It was close to collapse. It had been badly damaged in the June 2025 war. Its air defenses were in pieces. Its arsenal of ballistic missiles had been heavily depleted. It was deeply unpopular. It had been shaken by the protests that took place in January. Now was the moment to conduct the attack against Iran, and the whole house of cards would tumble. And the president listened, and apparently he accepted this entire view, backed by the head of Mossad, in a program we did with Professor Mearsheimer on Monday, which you could see on the Duran. Professor Mearsheimer spoke about the enormous influence that Mr. Barnett, the head of Mossad, had in persuading everybody that the political system in Iran had become so fragile that a gentle push would be enough to cause the whole thing to come tumbling down. And so the president, there and then, appears to have made the decision to launch the war against Iran that Prime Minister Netanyahu has been agitating for and calling for, well, pretty much for all of his political life. And what happened next was not just appalling, but frankly disgraceful, because the CIA, the US intelligence community, came back and said that the assessment that an attack on Iran would result in regime change was doubtful. The director of the CIA, Director John Radcliffe, said that the idea was farcical. The US Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, said that it was BS. And yet, none of these officials, apparently, despite their doubts, were prepared to push back strongly against the president's decision to launch the war, despite the doubts that all of them apparently had. And perhaps, from my point of view, the greatest criticisms can be made against General Kane, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He apparently also had doubts, but he too, despite evasions and prevarications, was never willing to stand up against the president and tell the president straightforwardly, Mr. President, this is an incredibly bad idea. It is extremely high risk and it probably won't work. So the United States launched its attack on Iran. Putting aside the issue of whether this operation was even viable, nobody involved, to repeat again, the vice president was away, seems to have pointed out the immorality, the illegality of starting a war in the midst of negotiations. That doesn't seem to have bothered anybody. But anyway, they carried out the attack. And as I said earlier in the program, and as we on the Duran and many others pointed out before, everything immediately began to go wrong. The government in Iran survived. Mossad's and Prime Minister Netanyahu's predictions of an immediate collapse turned out to be completely wrong. The government survived. Iran began to hit back. It hit back in an increasingly devastating way. To the president's astonishment, it did close the Strait of Hormuz. That did provoke a global economic crisis. And, well, from that moment on, the president lost control of the war and the initiative began to slip out of his hands. And, well, we saw how this all played out. About a week ago, over the last 2 weeks, there were many discussions about ground operations. There were deployments of special forces and of the 82nd Airborne Division and of Marine units to the Persian Gulf. There was talk about seizing Kharg Island and seizing islands in the Strait of Hormuz. There was talk of ambitious operations being carried out deep inside Iran to try to seize control, to capture Iran's nuclear stockpile, uranium stockpile. I and others far more expert in this area than me, Jim Webb, Daniel Davis, all sorts of others, pushed back, said that none of this makes any kind of military sense. All of these ideas are incredibly risky. They risk disaster. And I am going to suggest that perhaps the tipping point came over the last couple of days in connection with that disastrous operation. I think it was disastrous, close to Isfahan, the operation which we are told was launched in order to rescue the navigator of the F-15, which was shot down. Now, we still don't know the whole story about this operation, and there are many theories speculating as to what it was intended to achieve. There is, in fact, a growing consensus on social media that it was not about the rescue of the navigator at all, but was all part of some operation to try to capture and remove Iran's nuclear stockpile. I still have my doubts about that. But again, I don't think that especially matters, because it is the overall result of the operation that is more important. The United States lost more aircraft in a single day over the course of that operation than it has lost since the end of the Vietnam War in a single day. It lost to C-130 Hercules aircraft, reconfigured electronically for special forces. It perhaps lost 2 Black Hawk helicopters. It lost an A-10 ground attack aircraft. Apparently an F-15 was damaged. As we know, an F-15 was destroyed. There are speculations about more helicopters, Little Bird helicopters, destroyed on the ground. There are speculations and, in fact, video footage of other helicopters returning to US bases with smoke trails behind them. And again, it's difficult to know how those pictures connect with this incident. The point overall, the underlying point, was that Iran is able to defend itself on its territory, that insertion operations, would encounter a strong Iranian response. And, well, that will have communicated to the United States that any attempt to seize airfields with the 82nd Airborne Division or Delta forces, or to carry out some kind of operation on the islands, that all of that would indeed have run into very, very tough resistance from the Iranians. There would have been casualties, heavy casualties. The Intercept, a US magazine, guesstimates US casualties in the war already at somewhere around 750 killed and wounded. I don't know whether that figure is true. But anyway, all of that, it all became clear, I think, after the Isfahan operation, that there was no military route towards victory in this war. And that came alongside articles, including articles of the British media, that a naval operation to force open the Strait of Hormuz is impossible, that the Iranians have missile and drone dominance, and that, as Professor Mearsheimer has put it, sending warships into this area, landing troops anywhere on Iranian territory, would be a kamikaze mission. I think after the Isfahan operation, that became so true that even the President of the United States was obliged to see it. And so we got this extraordinary series of truly terrible statements from the President of the United States. Statements on Good Friday and on Easter Saturday, threatening the killing of Iranian officials, other massive actions against Iran if Iran did not agree to a ceasefire. The President, by this time, understood that a military victory was unachievable. He was aware of the constant increases in energy prices. He knows the effect this will have on him politically if it is sustained, and the consequences for the global economy. There might be further pressures, of course, upon him that we don't know about. I received a report about a week ago that China was again restricting exports of rare earths. So the President, under intense pressure, started to let off in the most terrible way on Truce Social, in social media posts, even as he threatened Iran with utter devastation if it did not agree to open the Strait of Hormuz, an unconditional opening of the Strait of Hormuz. And all of this culminated in a truly terrible post that the President wrote and published yesterday, in which he spoke about the prospect of the death of Iran's entire civilization. I have to say that I've never seen a statement like that made by any US president. I never imagined that I would ever see something like that. I think that long after this conflict has ended, that statement will be remembered. It's been compared to me with the kind of statement that one spouse to another makes, from which there is no return and which ends a marriage. I think it was a terrible thing for the president to say. I have already spoken about how in previous wars, other presidents, far greater presidents than the current one, Washington, Lincoln, Roosevelt, Eisenhower, have managed to maintain control of themselves, to project at all times a sense of authority and calm. And, well, the president failed at that test. And certainly the Iranians will have seen this as a sign of weakness. And I would add that in Britain, and I believe to some extent in the US, there was the tone of his statement actually provoked speculation that in his desperation, the president might actually resort to the use of nuclear weapons, which, by the way, I don't personally believe was ever the case. Anyway, that showed how desperate by this point he was. And so along came the Pakistanis. They suggested this 2-week ceasefire. The Iranians said to the Pakistanis, Trump can have this ceasefire provided we retain control of the Strait of Hormuz and provided the negotiations after the ceasefire are on the basis of our 10-point agreement. And that is why I think the president, in subsequent statements, has spoken as if it is indeed the 10-point agreement that is going to be the basis of future talks. It was the price he had to pay in order to get the ceasefire that would get him out of the terrible position in which he finds himself in. So where does that leave us? Well, on Trump's side, I am going to suggest that things are perhaps a little less hopeless than they appear. Trump has now been brought to the very edge of the abyss. He was in a situation where he was facing utter defeat. He was looking at a potential global economic crisis of astonishing dimensions. And Iran was not talking to him and was not compromising. I doubt that he will want to be put in that position again. I think if Netanyahu comes back to Washington and tries to talk him back into the war, I think this time, at least, Trump will be a lot more careful. That's my own guess. We'll have to see. Anyway, that's the American side. What about the Iranian? Why did the Iranians agree to a ceasefire after they had repeatedly said that they were not prepared to agree to a temporary ceasefire and had repeatedly said that the only resolution of the conflict that they would accept would be one that was made on the basis of their terms, which are, of course, identical to the 10 points that they have set out. Well, I think that the Iranians obviously did not want to see a massive attack upon them by the United States, which would have resulted in the destruction of at least some of their infrastructure. I don't think, however, that that was the major reason for the sudden softening in the Iranian position. The Iranians have absorbed many blows, and they have shown that they have the ability to conduct further blows. They have apparently told the Pakistanis that they have tens of thousands of ballistic missiles still in their arsenals, and uncounted thousands of drones. So they were confident that they could sustain the war. If there'd been this enormous attack upon them yesterday by the United States, they would have given as good as they got. That would have made the crisis in the Middle East even worse. And you could argue that over time, that might have put Iran in an even stronger position. But the Iranians cannot sustain the war without some support from their friends. Pakistan has been one of their friends, but of course the key ones, as I've discussed in many programs, have been China and Russia. And now that we can see that there has been a ceasefire, we can look back and we can see that the signs that the Chinese and the Russians were seeking an end to the conflict, or at least an end to the fighting, were there. The key event was the visit of the Pakistani foreign minister to Beijing, where he had a meeting with the Chinese foreign minister, Wang Yi. And the Chinese have provided a readout of this meeting, and I will read it. Wang Yi noted that having just hosted the quadrilateral foreign ministers meeting in Islamabad, the Pakistani side wasted no time in coming to Beijing to hold joint discussions on ways to de-escalate tensions in the Middle East. Pakistan's active mediation efforts to promote peace and end conflict reflect its firm commitment to safeguarding regional and global peace. Timely strategic communication and enhanced strategic coordination between China and Pakistan on major international and regional issues is exactly an inherent part of China-Pakistan community with a shared future. China supports and expects Pakistan to play a unique and important role in de-escalating the situation and restoring peace talks. The process is not easy, but Pakistan's mediation efforts serve the common interests of all parties. Only by achieving a ceasefire and stopping the fighting can we prevent the conflict from spreading, avoiding more casualties, ensure the security of the Strait of Hormuz, and safeguard international energy security and the stability of production and supply lines. China stands ready to work with Pakistan to overcome difficulties, remove disruptions, quell the flames of war as soon as possible, create opportunities for peace, and open the window for peace talks. And after that meeting, Wang Yi and Mohammad Ishaq Dar, the Pakistani foreign minister, published a 5-point initiative. And can I just say here, it's clearly a Chinese initiative. And it sets out the following 5 points: immediate cessation of hostilities, start of peace talks as soon as possible, security of non-military targets, security of shipping lanes, and that refers to the Strait of Hormuz. It says the Strait of Hormuz, together with adjacent waters, is an important global shipping route. China and Pakistan call on all parties to protect the security of ships and crew members stranded in the Strait of Hormuz, allow the early and safe passage of civilian and commercial ships, and restore normal passage through the strait as soon as possible. And the last point, which is to some extent, I suppose, boilerplate, primacy of the United Nations Charter. So China, a vital friend for Iran, one which has definitely been providing intelligence assistance, and one which is the primary party that would be there to provide economic assistance in future, made it very clear that it wanted a ceasefire and that it wanted a return to talks and a restoration of peace in the Persian Gulf, and that ultimately means a restoration of transit of ships through the Strait of Hormuz. Notice that the Chinese stress that it is civilian shipping that should be able to pass through the Strait of Hormuz. Military warships and presumably ships carrying military cargoes do not have China's support in the same way. And the Chinese also insist, or rather do not in this statement appear to object to Iran maintaining some degree of control over the Strait of Hormuz. Well, that is the Chinese. The Russians have been more publicly supportive of Iran in some respects than China has been. They have referred to the attack on Iran as an act of aggression. They have undoubtedly, of this I am certain, provided Iran with a significant amount of military assistance, including intelligence and help with drones and ballistic missiles and those sort of things. But when you drill down closely, what you can see is that the Russian position and the Chinese positions are identical. The Chinese want a ceasefire, so do the Russians. It seems to me that, as is so often the case, the Chinese and the Russians have worked closely together. In fact, they confirmed that they were working together on this conflict. There was a division of labor. China would work as the primary mediator. Russia would work as the country that was supplying Iran with the means it needed to keep fighting. But of course, ultimately, that Russian assistance to Iran provided both China and Russia with the leverage they needed to try to get the Iranians to agree to a ceasefire. And here I should say that on the 6th of April, the Russian Foreign Ministry published a statement about the situation in the Middle East, and it says this: the Foreign Ministry reiterates its call for the immediate termination of hostilities. We welcome the efforts taken by several states, including Pakistan, Turkey, and China, to de-escalate tensions around Iran in order to launch a dialogue on a lasting and sustainable normalization in the Middle East. So we can see that the Russians here are referring to mediation efforts by China and that they are supporting them. And the Russian statement says many other things, and they speak about, we believe that there is still a chance for a political and diplomatic settlement. The parties to the conflict must abandon the language of threats, unacceptable insults, and ultimatums, and avoid actions that could plunge the entire region into irreparable chaos. The last point is exactly the same as Wang Yi's point to the Pakistanis about the risks of the conflict spiraling out of control and of the enormous danger were it to do so. So, the Iranians yesterday had this request from the Pakistanis to agree a 2-week ceasefire. They will have known that the Russians and the Chinese support it. They would have got the key concession that they're left in control of the Strait of Hormuz, and they've been provided with the further concession that the United States is at least claiming, saying, if without much conviction, that it is prepared to negotiate on the basis of Iran's 10-point plan. The Iranians are not in a position to accept total isolation, to continue the war in complete isolation. The Russians, Russia, a far more powerful country than Iran, has worked very hard to avoid isolation in the conflict in Ukraine. It knows the enormous risks to itself if it did. The Iranians, in a weaker position than Russia, know that they cannot risk that possibility. So, for that reason, they agreed to the ceasefire. If you go through all of the public statements, if you look at the situation, you can see why the ceasefire happened yesterday. Now, to repeat again, the Iranians have agreed a ceasefire when they're in a position of advantage, and that leaves them in a stronger position in any peace talks. The Pakistanis are talking about peace talks between the United States and Iran starting in Islamabad on the 10th of April. We will see whether that happens. The United States, having been previously in a much stronger position, now is in a much weaker one. It has exhausted all military options. It has risked a global economic crisis. In the case of the president, he has risked political disaster. I would have thought, and again I speak with no very great conviction here because we're talking about a very unpredictable man, to say the least, but I would have thought that the president himself would want to do a deal, even if it was a lot more favourable to Iran than he would wish, and a lot more favourable to Iran than the deal he might have done before he took the disastrous decision to launch the attack. But then, of course, we'll just have to see. One person has come out of this obviously angry, the clear loser, and potentially the spoiler. That is Prime Minister Netanyahu. The Israelis are making it clear today that they do not consider that the ceasefire extends to Lebanon, even though that is exactly what the Iranians themselves and the Pakistanis obviously believed. And it's not difficult to understand what Netanyahu is doing. I said earlier in the program that Netanyahu knows perfectly well that he cannot wage a successful war against Iran by himself. Israel's resources are not equal to that. He needs the United States on side. That has been his objective all along. So, continuing the war with Hezbollah in Lebanon, possibly, he may calculate, will create conditions where Iran feels that it has no option but to come to the rescue of Hezbollah by intervening militarily on its behalf. And then Netanyahu will be running back to Washington and telling the president, well, the Iranians are coming after Israel. You must defend us. What one would like to believe will now happen is that the president, or perhaps more realistically the vice president, or someone else will pick up the phone and will call Netanyahu and will tell him that this is absolutely unacceptable. This fighting in Lebanon must stop. It must stop now. The United States has the power to do that, but if I have to be honest, I don't think the president will. Israel still obviously has its friends in Washington. Senator Graham is still there, and he's not going to be happy with this agreement either. There will be people within the administration who won't be happy, people like Pete Hegseth and Mike Waltz. Rupert Murdoch, and the Murdoch media, which appear to exercise outside influence over the president, they too will be unhappy, and they will certainly push back against any attempt to put pressure on Prime Minister Netanyahu. Well, we will see what the president does. I said this was a fragile ceasefire. This is what makes me think it is fragile. If the conflict in Lebanon continues as Netanyahu intends, then the pressure on Iran to intervene is going to be very great, at which point it is highly likely that the war will resume all over again, despite the president's possible own doubts and wishes, and despite the desires of most of the countries of the Persian Gulf, of China and Russia and the rest. Anyway, this is where we are. This has been a disastrous affair. It has inflicted enormous damage on the Western alliance. There are now public tensions between the United States and its European allies. The president, deep down, whatever he may pretend, knows that this operation did not turn out well for him. He has lost face. He will be looking for ways to retrieve that. A military operation against Cuba is one possibility. But I do wonder, given how angry he feels with the Europeans, whether we might be more likely over the next few weeks to see a resumption of the demands for Greenland, and perhaps even Iceland too. So that crisis might restart all over again. Just saying. For the rest, the Persian Gulf states are going to have to make some very difficult decisions. They have now seen that the US security guarantee that they relied upon is effectively worthless. That might cause them to revisit aspects of their foreign policy. I noticed that Arab leaders continue to troop up and telephone Lavrov and Putin. The foreign minister of the UAE called Lavrov yesterday, for example. I am not sure where all of this is going to go. The Arab states, the Persian Gulf states, let themselves be used as a cat's paw by the Trump administration and the UN Security Council. A UN Security Council resolution was cobbled together calling for the reopening, steps to be taken to reopen the Strait of Hormuz. The Chinese and the Russians, to the surprise of many people, vetoed it. The Russians have made it clear that they believe that despite the fact that all the language about military enforcement having been taken out of the resolution, in reality, the resolution, just as earlier UN Security Council resolutions made over the course of the Libyan crisis were used, that this resolution would also be used eventually to justify military action. So that is the basis upon which they say they vetoed it. But for the record, I believe that another reason was that the Chinese and the Russians did this as a quid pro quo to the Iranians in order to get the Iranians to agree to the ceasefire. The Russians and the Chinese basically said, look, we're not going to contest your control over the Strait of Hormuz. We are going to veto the ceasefire, the resolution that does, but we do want you to agree to the ceasefire in return. Well, whether, as I said, all of this will hang together, what calculations the Persian Gulf states are going to take in the future, I simply don't know. I'm going to say that they played a strong hand before the war, very badly in my opinion, publicly saying that they were opposed to the war, whilst apparently secretly lobbying for it. And when the war began, they found themselves trapped in a situation that they were unable to control. So anyway, what they're going to do now, we shall see. But overall, the United States has lost face. President Trump has lost face. Iran has come out of this conflict stronger. The single biggest winner, for the record, in my opinion, is China. China was the party that ultimately played the decisive role in getting the ceasefire in place. It is emerging as the arbiter of conflicts in the Persian Gulf and in the Middle East. As for the Russians, well, they can argue that in a sense they've come out on top as well, but their priority remains, as it always has, Ukraine. And, well, I'm not going to discuss Ukraine here in this program. That would hardly be an appropriate thing to do. One doesn't tack on a topic like that at the back end of a program like this. But I will be returning to the situation in Ukraine shortly in my next video. For the record, I believe that after all that has taken place, the Russians will feel that the Americans have